Tayler Zavitz is a PhD candidate, sessional instructor, and teaching assistant, consultant, and coordinator in the Sociology department at the University of Victoria. Her current research area is political sociology and social movements, with a specific focus in critical animal studies. Her PhD research focuses on the repression of animal activism in Canada and the expanding criminalization of dissent. She also holds a master's degree in critical sociology with a focus in critical animal studies from Brock University. She's a current social media coordinator for the Animals and Society Research Initiative at the University of Victoria, as well as a peer reviewer for the Journal of Critical Animal Studies. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me, Janine.
Absolutely. So I'm curious to know, I always like to hear about how people found the vegan path and when, and then how has that influenced this decision to become a sociologist?
Yeah, so I really started at the age of about 12 was when I first went vegetarian. I had seen a PETA slaughterhouse video by accident. And at the time I was like, I'm never eating meat again. I don't want to contribute to that. And being so young and naive, I thought that by being a vegetarian, I was no longer contributing to the suffering of animals. And it wasn't until many years later, during my first year of university, that I became involved with an animal rights club on campus. And they were holding an Earthling screening one night. And I didn't know anything about the film. And I went to the film, and I basically walked in as a passive vegetarian and I walked out as an angry and active vegan. I realized, how ignorant I was to the reality of animal industries and the suffering that I was still contributing to on a daily basis. And so really I left that screening and promised that I would do everything I could to create change for animals moving forward. And I was also very lucky that while I was going through this transition, I happened to have been pursuing my education at a university that had a specialized critical animal studies program, which was one of the only one of its kind in the country at the time, and I believe still. So going into my undergrad, I was focused in political science. By my second year of university, I had changed my path and was taking like any critical animal studies course that I could. And it became my number one focus. So I kind of really threw myself into the field of critical animal studies and wanted to learn like everything I possibly could about it. After my undergrad, I completed my master's degree at Brock as well in critical sociology. And again, my focus was in critical animal studies. And now I'm doing my PhD in sociology, but again, focusing, like having that foundation of critical animal studies as well. I mean, it's an area of academia that it's definitely growing and expanding with each year, but I think it's still often widely ignored or diminished as a legitimate field of study, despite the fact that these issues, the large scale animal suffering and exploitation that we're seeing are gravely important, not only in their own right, but also they intersect with so many other social justice issues as well. So I think education is so important. I really believe that a great deal of people are just ignorant to what's actually happening to animals. And so I see this through my teaching all the time in the courses that I'm teaching. People really just have no real knowledge about animal industries. In Canada, a lot of people think that stuff that they do see is in the United States. And so they're like, no, we don't do that here. And so for me, like a big part of my decision to pursue my academic path was kind of twofold, I guess. First was simply to educate, right? To create a space within academic discussions to highlight the reality that animals are facing. And second, I guess, to work within the system to help legitimize the field of critical animal studies and, push for a more truly inclusive education system.
So critical animal studies, yeah, I don't think there was anything like that when I was at UVic at all. And so is sociology, what exactly is sociology? And am I correct in defining you as a sociologist then?
Yeah, my main, I would say I'm a sociologist and a critical animal studies scholar. Critical animal studies is kind of like a subfield that fits within the sociological kind of ideologies. I mean, sociology is where I focus generally because there typically aren't critical animal studies programs. So, critical animal studies at Brock was you could do a minor in critical animal studies through the sociology department. And so my main focus is definitely sociology because that's kind of the avenue that I've been able to have these conversations about animals when there hasn't been any sort of critical animal studies programs or classes. So I mean, it's a bit of like a very small kind of field right now in the sense of it's not widespread or mainstream within universities. But what you're starting to see now is that there's courses that are popping up that professors are able to teach on critical animal studies, or some universities have a few different courses that are now interdisciplinary, and so you can kind of take them from multiple programs. So it's definitely evolving. Canada's been behind for sure in that. The United States has had multiple programs and courses like that for many years, and Canada's kind of getting it together a little bit, and they're starting to do that. But it's kind of hit or miss, and it really depends on whether or not you can find like a professor that's in that kind of interest area.
Okay. And so it's a great place to be then. I mean, if it's just sort of happening and you can be there on the ground floor. And so sociologist is kind of the study of society. Is that right? You're analyzing trends through society, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sociology is looking at social interaction, how we interact with one another, the reasons that we interact with one another the way that we do, looking at things that are socially constructed, right? So the social construction of race or of gender or of sexuality, and within that obviously fits the social construction of animals as the other, right? And so it's really just focusing on the social kind of aspect of how we interact with one another.
So the intersectionality piece is really interesting. In the discussion that is online, you seem to really enjoy talking about that and the connection. The sort of, I guess, ideological connection between the oppression of animals and the oppression of people. And is that a lot of what you're studying? No, I think the focus of what you're studying though is more about animal activists and how they've been treated. But I guess
Mhm.
there's parallels there. It's a huge field. I'm
It
not even
is.
sure how to get into it.
I know it encompasses a lot for sure. And I think that's why it's so wild to me that it isn't being talked about more, because I think people, they think of critical animal studies and they think it's like this very like kind of small focused area, and that's not the case at all. People think critical animal studies are everything from looking at the behavior of animals. Like you have animal behaviorists who are talking about how animals interact with each other, to things like sentience, or um, then we get into everything to do with animal activists being repressed. We talk about the intersection of oppressions. Like it's so all encompassing, and that's why I think it's so important that more people are engaged with it. But definitely intersectional theory is something that I've focused on over the years throughout my work, and it does definitely relate to activist repression as well. Because when you think of, and I think this is something that the movement, unfortunately, the mainstream movement, a lot of people don't understand. People think that as soon as you start focusing on like intersectional theory, you start talking about the intersection of oppression, like you're losing out on talking about animals, and that's simply not the case. We have to be thinking about these issues in the larger, broader context of what they have in relation to one another. So when you're looking at the oppression of animals, none of these oppressions are identical. That's not what I'm saying by any means, but the patterns of oppression, there's identical ideologies or basis behind them. So all of these oppressions, whether it's the oppression of people of color or of women or whoever it may be, they all have similarity in terms of like discrimination, right? Violence, this idea of domination, this idea of othering, right? These patterns of oppression are all connected. And so if we're only going to focus on one of them, we're doing a disservice to that movement because we're not looking at it in the larger context of how this plays out in society, right? How do things like capitalism come into play when we're talking about these issues, right? What is upholding these ideologies and keeping these specific people in these specific places, right? And it's these larger systems that a lot of the time animal activists are not talking about. And I think that's a major flaw in what we're doing right now, because we can talk about these, smaller kind of individual cases, which are important, but unless you're looking at it from this larger context, you're really not going to dive deep enough for people to understand what we're getting at.
Right. And how people in society have sort of come to accept a certain level of oppression. And if you accept it in this group, then it's easy to transfer it over to there. And the role of the media, I think, is really important too. Okay, well, let's focus on then the animal activists, because there's a court case going on right now in BC. There's new ag gag laws across Canada. So I mean, you're right there in the thick of it, and it seems like the history is sort of become like at a pinnacle right now, and could kind of go either way. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting place to be right now, for sure, within my work. I mean, I really got into the work that I'm doing now when I learned about the history of the activist repression in the United States. And that was through Will Potter's book, Green is the New Red. Um, and that kind of came out at a pivotal time for me when I was really starting to get involved with critical animal studies. And that's really pushed me in the direction that I'm in now. I mean, the history in the United States is extensive in terms of activist repression, with the two most notable legislation. There's the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and ag legislation in the US. The AETA, or the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, that came into place in 2006, and that amended the Animal Enterprise Protection Act of 1992. And that prohibits anyone from engaging in conduct or in conduct for the purposes of damaging or interfering with the operations of what they call an animal enterprise. And it covers any act that either damages or causes the loss of any real or personal property, and or places a person in reasonable fear of injury, which is so broad that really anything could be kind of thrown into that legislation. So this legislation was specifically to target animal activists. And if you're charged under this legislation, you're deemed a terrorist in the United States. And there have been a number of activists who have been charged under this legislation, including the Shack 7. And there's a really great documentary on Netflix, if anybody hasn't heard about it. Most people probably have by now, but called The Animal People. And that follows the story of the Shack 7 in great detail. And it's a really incredible story, not only in terms of animal activist repression, but just generally on the repression of activist movements and how they're targeted by governments. And then you've got egg.
Can you talk about it just briefly for people who haven't heard about it? Shack 7?
So the Shack 7 was a group of activists who were campaigning against animal testing in the United States, specifically against Huntington Life Sciences, which is the largest animal testing company in the US. And so it's a case, specifically these 7 activists were targeted under this legislation, and many of them spent numerous years in federal prison after being charged under this legislation, merely for things like conspiring to violate the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So it's a really interesting case, because not only was it this idea of conspiracy, so they weren't even saying that they actually violated this legislation, they were conspiring to do so. But it was essentially a case where it was that this campaign was very successful. They were doing very well. They were getting close to shutting down this specific company, and the government and industry went after them. And it's a clear example of just how powerful these industries and corporations are, and especially given that they work so closely with the government, and how this group of activists pressure campaigning against this specific industry was very effective, and how, because of that effective activism, the government retaliated and, pushed through specific legislation that targeted these specific activists. And so it's a really, even if you're not necessarily interested in animal issues, I think it's a really important case just to look at in terms of like social justice movements and how they're targeted by governments.
Right. Okay, and then so this was way before any of the ag gag legislation, and now we're seeing more of that specifically is targeting animal rights people, animal
Right.
liberation activists.
Right. Yeah. AGAG legislation. Again, that was something that was in the States primarily. And just as the name suggests, it attempts to essentially gag whistleblowers or undercover investigators or activists by making it an offense to photograph or video anything that's taking place within animal agriculture. So when I was completing my master's, which was in 2015, we didn't have anything like that in Canada. Like there was nothing on the books in Canada that was specifically targeting animal activists. So activists were absolutely still being targeted and surveilled and, labeled as terrorists by lawmakers and industry in conversations about them. But we didn't have any specific legislation on the books that was targeting animal activists. Um, in my master's thesis, I argued at the time that because of what was happening in the US and given the uptick at the time in undercover investigations and animal activism that was gaining mainstream attention in Canada, I argued that we would see the emergence of legislation like this within Canada that was specifically targeting animal activists. And unfortunately, that has happened now. And so, government and industry are now in Canada implementing ag legislation in multiple provinces to target animal activists as well. So you've had it passed in Alberta as well as in Ontario, and Manitoba is now trying to have it passed as well as BC. And there's also a federal bill that's being discussed for this type of ag legislation as well.
Hmm. And what about other countries, like European countries or Asian countries? Do they have this kind of legislation, or do you know?
Not that I'm aware of. And that's something, I kind of debated within my research of actually looking at something like this more kind of broad context of a more like global look at this type of legislation to see what there is. But to my knowledge, and this could absolutely be wrong, there isn't this type of like specific terrorist legislation. I know I think it's Australia, potentially the UK, there was talks about it, this idea of like terrorist dialogue within these specific areas. I don't know if it was ever actually passed or it was something that was just kind of being talked about. But I mean, the terrorist dialogue around activists is something that's happening everywhere. It's just whether or not there's actual legislation in place is more of the question.
Right. And what kind of impact are you looking at? What kind of impact these ag gag laws are having, like on activists and on the public response to? Do people understand what's going on? Do you think?
I mean, I don't think people really understand the extent of these laws. Um, and again, I think that's really unfortunate because I think people see these as like, for anybody who's not involved within animal rights or cares about the issues, they're kind of seeing it as like, oh, well, it protects farmers, right, from people going into their farms. But it's so much more than that. These laws are written in a way that are so broad that they target so many different things, and they give these kind of overarching ideas about what these what these activists are doing. And so, in the law in Ontario, this is not only targeting those who are actually going into facilities and trying to document the conditions, but it's also targeting people who are just bearing witness, right? So specifically, that's targeting like Toronto Pig Save or the Save movement. I think they're referenced in general, but that's leaving it open to, say somebody was driving down the street one day and sees a slaughter truck on the side of the road and walks up to it and sees something horrific and takes a photo of it, they could potentially be charged under that legislation, right?
Mm.
And so it's leaving this up, like this open to this I mean, they're problematic to begin with. Like, they shouldn't be a law to begin with, but it's also just opening this up to major violations of somebody's basic kind of rights to expression or freedom of expression within Canada. And so I don't think people really understand that kind of context of it. Um, and I think people aren't really looking at the fact that, we're targeting animal activists, but we should be targeting the industry, right? We're criminalizing people who are exposing what's happening within these industries, but not criminalizing the people who are doing the things that are being exposed, right? And so that's something that I think needs to be a larger conversation that I don't think the general public is really understanding.
Right. And so I can kind of, I can kind of see that, let's say, there's this private property thing that I really fundamentally opposed to philosophically, but it exists. So people own the property. And so that means that if I go onto their property, I can't just walk into someone's house and start taking pictures. I can't, you can't just kind of go into a business and go into the back rooms and start recording things that are going on. I kind of get that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, yeah, what's going on inside these places is publicly funded to a large extent. And so I think my understanding is that there are already kind of trespass laws. There's already some legislation in place. It's just that now they're putting this terrorist label on it. Is that right? And so even the workers, you're saying even the workers can't blow the whistle, or they can be
Right.
charged. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, up until last year, like I said, activists have been targeted and charged for their activism for decades. Like, that's nothing new in Canada, but it was under general laws that were already in place, right? So, for example, like you said, like trespassing or mischief or criminal mischief or like break in and enter, harassment. These are the kind of generally applicable laws that were being applied to animal activist actions. And like you, I philosophically don't agree with things like, this idea of private property and that sort of thing. But that aside, we had these laws in place that activists were being charged under, and you can kind of understand in the sense of why that would happen, right? And I think any activist who was going into these places under those laws knew that. Like, I don't think there was any kind of debate as to whether or not they knew that they were breaking the law at that point. They were like, yeah, I'm going in because that's the right thing to be doing at this point, right? And these, if somebody was charged under these types of laws, like, they were generally resulting in fairly small fines. A lot of the time they were just thrown out. It just wasn't in the public interest to go forward with the case, so they'd get dropped. But if anything did result from it, it was typically like small fines. But this ag legislation now specifically targets animal activism, just like it does in the US. So, activists are now facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, as well as steep jail time if convicted under this sort of legislation. And so you're seeing, yeah, not only activists who can be targeted, but like you said, industry workers. So if somebody within the actual industry themselves came out because of something that was happening, they could be charged. It also kind of opens up this idea, and a lot of these ag laws were struck down as unconstitutional in the United States because of how problematic and broad they were, because they open up this issue too of things like whistleblowers in like old age facilities, right? Like people who are coming, or nursing homes that are coming out against things that are happening. Like, could we potentially be targeting them as well for exposing things that are happening? It also targets like journalists, right? This freedom of expression or free speech. So they're so broad and problematic that it could really target a number of different people. And that's why, they are being seen as unconstitutional in many places.
Hmm. And so do you know if there's any current challenges, charter challenges to the ag legislation that has been passed in Canada?
I don't think anything has happened as of yet. I do know that the Animal Protection Party or Animal Alliance of Canada are definitely looking into fighting it as unconstitutional, as well as animal justice. So I think you're going to definitely see that coming out, but I don't think anything has happened as of yet.
Right. And I've also heard that there's some effort to involve prison workers in animal slaughter, perhaps, or factory farming. Is that a thing? That-
Yeah, it's this like farm labor with prison workers has it used to be a fairly prevalent thing. I'm not sure what it's like in the United States, but there used to be facilities in Ontario, and then they were removed. I don't know what the actual reason was for it, but they are now potentially being implemented again. And so essentially what's happening is that prisoners are being used to raise animals on farms and then also being used to slaughter them. And so it's a way that, the industry is able to get work for them without having to actually pay. It's just a very problematic system all the way around in so many ways. I mean, you're exploiting people that are imprisoned. You're exploiting animals, and this whole idea of like this incarceral state of both the animals and the prisoners in that situation, who are then, the prisoners having to kill these animals. It's this very uh, problematic and very twisted kind of way of doing things. I don't know that much about it. It's something that, I've kind of heard come up from time to time. And it's something that I want to look more into because I think it's a very interesting kind of dynamic on how things are going. But there is a group, the name is escaping me right now, but there is a group working on that issue. Specifically in Ontario, I think it's in Kingston. I think it's Abolish Prison Farms is the group, and they're working to try and get it so that that doesn't happen.
Hmm. Okay, another place that there's sometimes animal testing and research going on is at universities. Can you speak about anything that you know that's going on at UVic?
It's very secretive. I know that. You don't typically have the opportunity to find much out about it. I do know that it's happening at UVic. The only thing that I've really been able to find is I was on the website kind of looking around, and there's forms that you can find on the website for those who are doing animal testing. And essentially there's like order forms. So for how many animals they're ordering. And like it will list, like you'll have to list what the experiments are that you're doing. And then it'll have at the end, like how you're going to euthanize the animal. And so there is stuff like that that I've been able to find in terms of, that it is taking place, but to actually find out what kind of experiments are being done, the types of animals that are being used, it's very difficult to find any sort of information on that, which, not surprising.
Right. Again, this sort of world of secrecy, and it just raises the question of why is this so secret? If there's
Right.
nothing wrong with what's going on here, then why can't we see it, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and to call people terrorists, label people terrorists for trying to just expose what's going on in these places, it's pretty outrageous. Yeah.
And I think that's always been part of the conversation that's always kind of shocked me, even with like the general public, is this idea that, if everything is so okay within this industry, why are we not just seeing what's happening? Right? If animal activists are these like Looney Tune type of people who just like love animals and don't want anything to happen to them. And
Crazy.
that's right. Yeah. Right. If that's kind of all that animal activists are doing, okay, fine. But let's just see what is actually happening then. Right. Why are we just not able to see that? And
Mhm.
that's the very weird kind of context that I've never really been able to wrap my head around, is how people don't question that part of it, even if they don't agree with tactics or, strategies that activists are using. How are you not questioning why it's hidden so much?
Yeah, that's the question. Okay. So your work then, you're working on your PhD. What's the status of that?
It's going.
Mhm.
It's a process for sure. Especially, I'm teaching courses as well, and so that takes up a lot of time. But really, my PhD research is kind of stemming from my master's research. So my master's research was really looking at what I call the dual failure of the Canadian legal system. And so it was looking at, how the laws obviously fail animals in Canada, but then also how the laws were failing animal activists. And at that time, I was just looking at, some cases that had come up about basic things like we were talking about, like trespassing or break and enter and that sort of stuff. And at the time, I realized that a master's was just not enough time to really dive into what was actually happening in Canada. And just like I said earlier, with the idea that, a lot of people think that this kind of stuff only happens in the United States. I think a lot of people, even animal activists, think that activist repression, the way that until now, with everything that's kind of come out, people really thought that activist repression was only really happening in the US. And so what I was finding was that, you'd go to a specific place. Like if you're in Ontario and you're involved there, about cases within Ontario of activist repression. If you're out in BC, about some cases out here. But it wasn't really cross-referenced. Like we didn't know about them in terms of Canada in general. Like what was the Canadian context in terms of talking about animal activists? Like was there a larger issue that we weren't talking about? And so that's why I wanted to move forward with my PhD and really kind of dive into that issue. And so what I am going to be doing with my research is looking at like a historical kind of narrative in terms of activist repression in Canada. So looking back and seeing like what was kind of the context, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago within Canada, like what was happening with animal activists? Are we only now within the last 20 years seeing like activist repression happening, or has this been going on for a period of time? And so I'm really kind of trying to do this historical context of Canada because we just don't have that currently, and people aren't talking about it. And there's so many key people within this movement that people just don't know about, that like have been working for decades that people just don't know about, which I think is terrible and just like a major failure of our movement. And so I really want to bring in those voices of people who were, on the ground at the very beginning, like fighting for this issue and what they've seen throughout the different years and how things have changed and where we're seeing things now.
Yeah, and the impact of social media, I think, has really shifted everything. And then we see things like in Alberta, I was just speaking with an activist named Max Ma, who was arrested in the turkey at a turkey farm. That they raided a turkey farm, and when we say raided, they went in really with the intention of just taking pictures and video and sharing that they're not doing any damage. Maybe they want to take some of the animals if they can, but that's the act of terrorism.
Right.
But he said after that, then he, later on, then he was arrested and he went to trial and then he was smeared in the media. But Jason Kenney, the premier, went to that same turkey farm and announced the new ag gag legislation. So clearly there's a connection there, and he wanted to make sure people knew about that.
Right. And I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all. Through my research, there's been a number of times where I found there was an article in, I think it was a 2018 Hog Farmer magazine. There was an article about, it was called like extremist tactics of animal activists or something like that. And it was talking about this OPP officer, which is the Ontario Provincial Police, who for the last 9 or 10 years has been surveilling activists. And she works in the hate crimes unit of the OPP. And she was talking about activism under left-wing terrorism. And so you've got this OPP officer who spent all this time watching animal activists. And then she, shortly after that article came out, OPP officers went to a poultry council meeting to talk to farmers about how to deal with animal activists. And so you have this like very close relationship between policing, governments, and industries that you just don't see outside of that kind of industry. Like you would never have an OPP officer come to an activist meeting to talk about how to deal with farmers, right? Like it would just never happen. And so you see this really close relationship between these industries and governments and police that, come out in examples like that, where they're making an example out of that specific case, or, they're going and talking to farmers on how to deal with us. And so that's a very different relationship than the relationship we have with police and governments.
Well, I think the fact that governments are heavily invested, like in the billions of dollars in animal agriculture, and the police are working for them, and also, on the receiving end of government handouts, which really is our tax money, when it comes down to it. So I know you like to advise activists to be careful about police and police infiltration, and that's certainly something that we can see intersectionally across any movement. Peace activists know to watch out for that, for example. Yeah, so that's a real thing in the animal rights liberation movement too, is it?
It is. And unfortunately, it's something that that's one of the most contentious things I think that I ever say that really gets people worked up is like, don't talk to cops. And activists, a lot of these like mainstream activists are saying like, well, we're not doing anything wrong. So like, why can't we talk to them? And it's that kind of like naive understanding of policing and like the institution of what they stand for and who they're working for that's so problematic. There's a huge extensive history in specifically the UK about police infiltration of animal activist groups specifically, to the point that there's been undercover police officers who have spent years within the activist community, and have married and had children with activists. And then years later, it comes out that they've been an undercover police officer.
Like that whole
That
time while they're married and everything? Oh my gosh. How
like that is absurd, right? And so you have stuff like this happening. And again, it's really been highlighted in the UK. And that would be something interesting to look at too, like why specifically the UK have these like undercover police officers really been used as a tactic. But it's happening in the United States and it's happening in Canada as well. And so it's not only in regards to these potential undercover police officers, but just this general idea that, you have a police officer who shows up to a protest, right? They show up, they start engaging with activists. I've never been to a protest where a police officer hasn't shown up and at least one of them has said that he has either a wife, a girlfriend, a fiance, a sister, a brother, someone that they know that's vegan. Like, it's like this common kind of conversation or opener. I don't know if they learn that in policing school on how to talk to us.
It's kind of the equivalent of having a Black friend.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this idea that like, oh, now he's on our level, right? Like now we can have a conversation because he knows a vegan, so it's fine. Or, they'll come up and be like, yeah, I haven't been eating as much meat lately. And it's just this way of them trying to open up the conversation. And, they'll come up and they'll say, oh, I'm officer so-and-so, like, what's your name? Like, why are we providing our names to officers? There's no reason to be providing our name to a police officer unless you're actually being detained. And so many activists are so willing to just give out their information. And so then you have something like this come out where it says an OPP officer has been surveilling activists for 10 years under the hate crimes unit. And you're thinking, why are we providing them with information, right? And it's just, there's no reason to be doing it. And so we shouldn't be doing it because it's putting not only ourselves in a sticky situation, but the movement as a whole, right? Like that one individual who's talking to a cop at a protest or whatever it may be, maybe nothing happens to them, but they're there for a reason. They're trying to get information. They're trying to put things together. They're trying to make a case against activists. And by doing that, you're opening up that possibility of creating that larger conversation for them, right? And so it's just, there's no reason to be talking to them. And so we shouldn't be talking to them. And I think the more that people recognize that, the better off this movement is going to be. Because you think of, I think of these activists like the Shack 7 or these people who have spent years in federal prison. And I just think like and I think that's the biggest problem with the movement, in that people don't know about the history of it. And I think that opens us up to a potential problem, because if you don't know this history of activist repression, if you don't know about the people that have spent years in federal prison, if you don't know that this movement has been targeted by police over the years, you're going to see that having a conversation with a cop is fine. But if you had that knowledge, you won't be talking to that cop, right? And so I think that's a major flaw right now within the movement, is that we don't have that historical context of what's happened, how these governments and industries and policing are working against us, and then what that means and how we should be considering that in our day-to-day activism.
Yeah, and I think, if like I've been involved as an activist for a long time, so I've seen this from a lot of different angles, and I think if unless you really sort of understand the impact of that capitalism has, like the idea that we're trying to save animals, but we're also infringing on the ability of these companies to make bazillions of dollars in profit, and that's subsidized by the government, that pays the police, that they advertise on the media. I mean, it's a huge system, and I can see that a young vegan, a new vegan, might just be enthused and want to go and save the animals, and just believe like, well, everybody should want to save the animals. Why wouldn't everybody want to save the animals? But there's this whole system in place and I really think it has to do with capitalism, that if there wasn't money involved here, it would be a whole different world, right?
Oh, absolutely it would. And, I think that's why when we're not having those larger conversations about like that capitalist system and the intersection of not only oppression, but also the intersection of all of these industries, we're not going to get anywhere. Because if you think that, you going just outside, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that street activism isn't effective. All forms of activism together are effective. But I think, if we think that just by going out and talking to one person, that's going to change everything without talking about that larger system, we're never going to get anywhere, because that's just not the way that the world works. And so we have to be looking at these larger systems of domination and oppression in order to understand how to really break those down.
Right. And so is that the kind of thing that you're teaching, or what are you teaching these days?
Right now I'm teaching, actually I'm teaching a very kind of out there class. It's a technology and society class, which doesn't really have anything to do with what I'm kind of focused on my research in, but I teach kind of a variety of things within the university. One of the courses that I've been teaching quite often is a crime and deviance class, which is a second year sociology class. And so that class, I've really been able to dive into things like crimes against animals is something that I focus on for a week out of the class. So even if it's not something that's specific to my research, I definitely always wiggle it in there, and I'm able to talk about it. But, even within the class that I'm teaching right now, this technology and society class, like I still manage to talk about, how we use technology in different aspects in terms of things like, drones. Like we're talking about these kind of advances in technology and using drones for things like whistleblowing, right? Using drones to go over different facilities and that sort of thing. So it's not in my research area what I'm teaching, but I always manage to talk about it regardless.
Good vegans do, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, we're on a
exactly.
mission. We're on a mission. Okay, well, we can't go. I know we're coming near the end of the time, but I don't think we can go without just addressing Reagan Russell. And it just seems a little too coincidental that the Ontario ag gag legislation came into place, and then Reagan Russell was in a vehicular accident where she was bearing witness, right? And so, are you examining the pattern of kind of backlash? I don't want to directly say that was connected in any way, but it is kind of coincidental that suddenly a longtime activist, an elder woman, was struck by a vehicle.
Right.
Can we connect ag legislation to different responses?
I mean, I would say you absolutely can. I mean, I was an activist with Toronto Pig Safe for years when I was in Ontario. And just from my own experience, I can say that there were numerous times where truckers would push it with activists and would speed up towards activists who they knew were standing in a roadway. So, and I always said, like, somebody's going to get killed at one of these because of how, and I will say it's not all truckers. There are some truck drivers that knew what the activists were doing. They did their thing, they pulled up, they gave the activists 2 minutes, and they drive away. There was a number of them who had respectful relationships with the activists. Obviously, they didn't agree with what they were doing, but they just kind of had that general understanding. But there were quite a few that would push it with activists. And so when I heard about Reagan, like, I was not surprised, unfortunately. And I think because this legislation came into place, I think it gave this kind of backing of like the laws on our side. And so I think it's kind of perpetuating this idea that they're protected and activists aren't, right? And so I think it's showing that, yeah, well, there's this law now that says that you can't bear witness and you did that. And so therefore that was your fault, right? And I think it's kind of opening up not only the legal targeting towards activists, but also just kind of the attack on activists from the actual industry itself. And I mean, you'll even see that in the Ontario legislation, it leaves it open that farmers can arrest activists themselves.
Oh.
So I don't even know what that means. Like, how do you say that, and how does that play out? So that's saying that if, an activist is on somebody's property, they can quote unquote arrest them or detain them. So it's leaving this like very kind of broad opening to the industry regulating itself and also having powers to detain and do things to activists. Right. And so that is highly problematic. And so I think because of the wording of this type of legislation, I think that kind of unfortunately resulted in a situation where people think that they're untouchable because they have been untouchable, generally speaking, up until now. And so with this type of legislation coming into play, now it's like, well, now we're definitely untouchable.
Right. Kind of like
unfortunately,
cops in the US kind of thing with the Black Lives Matter situation. Yeah, it's scary. And like I say, I really feel like we're at a turning point, and there are more and more vegans, not all activists, but certainly more people who may be coming sympathetic to the plight of the animals and on board with activism, theoretically at least, if not actually. And so, or we could see a wave against this draconian legislation, or we could just see it happen. And then, once it's in place, then it's really hard to reverse these things. So what, do you have any advice for new vegans, young vegans, or animal activists? What should we know, and how should we proceed?
Right. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that we have to know our history. And, that's not to say that you have to know every single person that's ever done animal activism, because that's merely impossible to do. But you have to have some sort of historical context to be working from. And I think, right now what we're seeing within this like mainstream animal rights movement is that you have these kind of young, naive individuals who are coming into activism because they want to get involved, which is fantastic. But they take on, or they get involved with, these kind of mainstream organizations, which a lot of them can be problematic themselves, or don't have that historical context themselves. And so we see these movements or these organizations that are kind of just stuck in what they're doing because we're not looking at what has happened historically. We're not able to move forward. Like, if we're not looking at the tactics and strategies of those before us, we're not looking at the successes and failures of what they've done, that's not going to help us moving forward. If we study, what types of activism have taken place historically within this movement, and how have people navigated things, and illegal tactics versus legal tactics, and how those play out in the media, or how they play out in how things get done. We need to be looking at those things in order to actually say, here's what worked, here's what didn't. Now, what are we doing? Because if we're continuing to do the same thing over and over, and it's been shown that it's not effective, we're not getting anywhere. And so, yeah, you can have more activists who are now coming out and doing like street activism and wanting to talk to people, which is great. But if that's the only thing that we're doing, or that's our only focus, it's not going to be effective long term. And so I think the biggest thing is knowing that historical context, like where have we been, where are we now, where are we going, right? And I think too, one of the biggest failures right now is that a lot of the focus is on a very few specific individuals within this movement who, for the most part, have come into this movement off of the backs of other people who have done the work before them and have kind of just taken on this role as like these incredible activists and who are getting all this sort of support. Um, Meanwhile, the people that have done the work aren't getting the recognition for it, right? Or people don't even know who they are, right? And so
So
specifically,
where can we go? Where can we go to find out who these people are? Or is there
yeah, I
books
mean,
or documentaries or anything? Or we should be making those then?
we absolutely should. I think I think that's definitely a part of it. I think I will say I think some of it's probably hard to find. Um, and so I'm not saying it's like a total fault, but of activists, but I also don't think people generally look into it either. And so I think like just doing like a quick, you could do like a quick Google search of like animal activism in Canada, and it's going to go back at least to a couple decades, right? To people talking about how activists or how activism was in, you know, for Ontario, for example, like Zoo Check Canada, Rob Laidlaw, you've got Liz White with the Animal Protection Party. Like these are people that have been on the forefront of this movement within Canada. That like, you know, Liz White started the Animal Protection Party of Canada. That's the only political party that's talking about animals. That's huge, right? How do people not know about that? And so I think, you know, we're doing a disservice to not only those individuals who have come before us and who have like worked their asses off to get to where we are today, but also to the movement moving forward. Like if we don't know about what they're doing, we can't really get on board, right? And so, and I think too, it's so important to be looking at specifically the women and people of color within this movement, who have really been at the forefront. This movement has primarily been made up of women. Like it was pretty much started by women, it's been upheld by women, and it continues to be mainly women. And that's not to say there are not incredible men in this movement who are doing great things, but you have to acknowledge the fact that this is primarily led by women. You know, people like Abreeze Harper or Karen Davis or Carol J. Adams, Liz White, Leslie Bisgold, first animal rights lawyer in Canada. That's incredible and huge, right? Manisha Deka, who's doing incredible things. Twyla Francois, who was one of the first ones doing undercover investigations in Canada. You've got AFCO, Lori Gruen, Patrice Jones, Joanne MacArthur, right? Rod Coronado, Dr. Margaret Robinson. Like these are all huge names within the animal rights movement who have done incredible things, and really pushed forth the conversation. And I think too, that's why, you know, we've got this critical animal studies field, which is incredible. And we've got like grassroots activism, but they don't really engage a lot of the time. And I think that's a big problem, because I think a lot of the time, those within critical animal studies who are studying this very issue have that historical context available to them and are talking about it, but then they don't translate that in actually providing that to activists. And activists are on the ground doing the work, like out on the streets, but aren't engaging with the critical animal studies scholars to tell them about what's happening, right? And so you have these like two divisions where really they should be working together. You know, this, if we collaborated from like animal focused scholars with grassroots activists, there's so much that they could learn from one another to create like a stronger and more cohesive movement. And I think that's a serious shortfalling of our movement right now, that we really need to be bridging those forms of activism, because education is critical for social change. Grassroots activism is critical for social change. And I think the power of the two together would be huge for moving forward.
Okay, let's do that. That's
Yeah.
awesome. and really inspiring that there's lots of opportunities and COVID friendly opportunities, it seems like too, right? All right. Well, thank you so much, Taylor. It's lovely to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Janine. I appreciate it.